what I'll be showing this morning, presenting to you here, the paper I've submitted. This is a part of a larger study. I really began just, like I say, I'm a resident historian at Monticello, so sometimes Cinder and I do whatever kind of comes down the pike. But then we have our pet projects also, and very early on, because of my background in clothing history and art history, I became very interested in primarily the life portraits of Jefferson, other images as well, but I've been looking a little more at the life portraits. And the one that I'm discussing this morning, which seemed, of course, more relevant for this conference, is Jefferson in his diplomatic years, and it is the Mather Brown portrait of Thomas Jefferson. It is the earliest known image, or let's say the earliest known formal portrait that we still, like I say, that we do know of. And so it's kind of a logical beginning anyway, but because it does show Jefferson the diplomat, this is the one that I chose to do for this conference. But what I thought I would do this morning is just try to present, and my feeling is that Jefferson, as being certainly the youngest of the trio that were in Paris at that time, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson, he was certainly his first time abroad, least experienced. An image that he's going to create in Paris is certainly not going to be the one that Dr. Franklin was able to pull off. And I think he's one of, well, I would say possibly the only one at this time period that was able to achieve this image and carry it off. And of course, this is the very well-known engraving by St. Alban from a drawing by Cochin, but we don't know what's happened to the drawing. But this became not only an image that we still see frequently today, is frequently reprinted, but this was a very popular image at the time. And I believe I did mention in my paper that I was pulling very much from Sellers' work in the portraiture of Benjamin Franklin, but his feeling is also that it wasn't done just to have a nice likeness of Franklin, but it was like a news item, and it was very quickly published and in print, and it was apparently widely distributed. But this is the one that does team very much with Franklin's own description of himself, which I did put in the paper when he writes back to London that describing himself as very plainly dressed, wearing my thin gray straight hair that peeps out under my only coiffure, a fine fur cap which comes down my forehead almost to my spectacles. Think how this must appear among the powdered heads of Paris. And the way he wrote that with exclamation point, I think he was, he was really relishing this, is the take I have on it. A lot of images began to appear. This was the first Houdin bust portrait, but I put it in. This is not the one, by the way, that Jefferson owned, and I'll get to it in a moment, but I put this in because, again, even Houdin has captured that straight gray hair, which was very much out of character for someone who would be appearing at the court in France. His image appeared everywhere. This is some Sèvres, a coffee cup, actually, but he began to appear on porcelain. And what, interestingly enough, that fur cap was something that became very notable. But artists that didn't have an opportunity to draw him from life, as Cochin had done, they thought, okay, fur cap, and they go to this painting of Rousseau. We don't have Franklin from life to see what this fur cap looks like, but, where can we go? Rousseau. Or how much was Franklin keying off of this Rousseau image? It was also a very well-known image. It had, after it was put into a mezzotint, it was widely dispersed. So people would have known this image. So, how did Franklin come up with it? I think that could be debated. So I found it very interesting when I saw this this reproduction of this little ivory box, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But on the cover of the box, we have Voltaire and Franklin, but depicted in a fur cap patterned after the one of Rousseau. So I think it is notable that you do then get Franklin linked with these two Enlightenment thinkers. And so certainly then I think the point I was trying to make is that Jefferson, when Jefferson gets off the boat, this is not something that he can achieve. But he does come to Paris. He begins very quickly, I mentioned in my paper, about trying to create this gallery of worthies. And certainly Jefferson, this was something, creating, and you're probably familiar with these, so I don't want to spend much time on it, but creating these collections of portraits of people that are in some way important. Of course, you had the family portraits, but this is very much then to create, it's more of a didactic portrait. It's to show these people for their importance to whatever group, whatever country. And it wasn't new. You can go back in the 17th century. I would recommend Brenda Bain Fortune, who's a curator at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. She's done a very fine study on these collections of worthies and their significance and when they began to be collected and appearing. But I know they date well back into the 17th century. So it wasn't a new idea at the time, but certainly it was something Jefferson began then, as he knew he was leaving the United States. He was actually traveling from Monticello up through Philadelphia on his way to Boston when he commissioned this portrait of George Washington from Joseph Wright, who was working in the United States at that time. Wright didn't have a chance to finish it. Jefferson took it unfinished, and then when John Trumbull comes over to London later, he has him complete the uniform, and everyone always points out that Trumbull put on a European epaulette instead of an American. But it's still, Jefferson felt very strongly that when he got to Europe, he needed a portrait of General Washington, to hang in his home there. So he begins his collection of worthies, as far as I've been able to determine, with Washington, probably the first. He very quickly adds this is another houdon of Benjamin Franklin, adds that to his collection. The next one I believe he gets is the John Paul Jones, which is here. Before he leaves, he has a Lafayette. I don't believe he acquired the houdon of Washington until he got back to the United States. I don't have those dates right in front of me. But in continuing to build this collection of worthies, he got very busy while he was in Europe, not only collecting these houdon portraits of Americans, but he also began to commission copies of portraits of other worthies who had in some connection with the American story. And here he commissioned a portrait of, oops, sorry, I'm pushing wrong buttons. Francis Bacon, and Newton, and John Locke. And these, of course, he referred to as his trinity. Oh, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but the three of the greatest minds. Let's see, my trinity of the three greatest men that the world has ever produced. His Newton, Bacon, and Locke. And then after acquiring them in Europe, we do know, of course, they did hang in Monticello after his return. So how did these men connect with the United States? Well, more from, of course, their Enlightenment theories, thought, ideologies. He obviously felt that they were important to American history, but then he went on to collect and commission portraits of explorers. And here we have Americus Vespucius, Columbus, then we have Cortez, Magellan, and then he, after seeing this one on his, this is Sir Walter Raleigh, which he saw in Birmingham, England, when he was touring there with John Adams, and he commissioned then to have this portrait done. So thinkers, explorers, early founders that had some link with the American experience. So these were also included then in this gallery of worthies that he was collecting. And of course put this one in that he did then, he had the Houdon bust portrait, but he commissioned what became one, and still remains as another of the very well-known Franklin images, sometimes called the fur collar portrait, but is the one by Duplessis. And he did not own an original, but he had Vallade then make a copy of it for him. So this also then, and it's hard to determine which of these actually hung in his residence in Paris, the Hotel de Lognac. He does make a reference to the Washington portrait hanging in the dining room, so we know he had it up, but quite possibly many of these others, as he began to collect them, began to appear in his Paris residence as well. So then you come to the question, when he commissions his own portrait to be done, and this happens on that trip to London in the spring of 1786, is he thinking that he too is going to hang among these worthies? Pete here shaking his head. Yeah, he's going to hang among the worthies. I would say possibly, yes. He did intend to have his portrait there. Now, he actually made the commission for a portrait of John Adams, and that's the one where he very definitely stated. He doesn't really say anything about his portrait, but he does state that he intends to have Adams' portrait. He wants it very much to hang in his collection of worthies. So this is the Mather Brown of Jefferson, and so it's the first one, like I say, I've kind of began studying. Because the position I take on this, I think we do see Jefferson at his most formal. Well, I will show you a couple of miniatures by Trumbull, but the Paris years in this first portrait is when I think we do see him looking certainly more European than he will in any subsequent portrait. However, I do argue in the paper, and it's going to be hard to see here because this is very dark, but that even though he is appearing very formal, I do feel that he's straddling the line a bit in that the coat he's chosen to wear in this portrait is what was called a frock coat at that time. And I keep pushing wrong buttons, sorry about that. It has a collar on the coat. The very formal dress coat did not. They had just a very high standing collar, but this is a turned down collar. It's much looser in the fit, which I realize that's a little hard to see here. Of course, he does have on a very fine waistcoat. This is the one I think he purchased ordered about 3 days after he got to London from a London tailor named Robert Cannon, although I think the coat is French because it doesn't have buttons. And why the French decided not to put buttons on their frock coats, but they didn't. That was the only distinguishing thing. The hair is far more formal, but let me go a little bit, not to spend too much time on this, but go a little bit more into the development of this frock coat. It was very much of an English, grew out of an English tradition. And I explain in the paper that the idea of just a simple frock, and we think now of using that term, I think, more in conjunction with little girls. But a frock did designate a male garment. Think of a monk's frock. It would really go back that far. Just kind of a loose-shaped garment with some sleeves, straight body, and that was about it. And workmen in England had worn them for quite some time. This is a porter. And I'm using the notes from Eileen Ribeiro, who is at the Courtauld Institute in London and very knowledgeable of this period. She has determined that this, and this is a Hogarth painting, by the way, called Canvassing for the Election. And here is the man back here canvassing. He's a little better dressed. But I was really more interested in showing you this character because here you have a frock, but you can see how shapeless it is. He's even wearing a belt over it, and he has a large shovel hat on, dark stockings, not white stockings. This gentleman we can't see much of, but I believe he's probably in a frock as well, and that it's very loose in the body. Let me show you a little more what I mean. Let's compare these figures in Hogarth here. This is from Latour. It's a pastel from Latour. And let's see, I don't have that date in front of me. It's around 1740 something. I've kind of lost my place here. But yeah, 1745 is the date on this particular painting. Now, already we're comparing French and English. And there's a little bit of distinction. But this is, of course, much more formal dress. When I say how loose the frock coat is, this skirt of these formal coats were really stiffened and pleated, so that now he's got it up over the arm of the chair, but I think you can see by the way it's extended there that even if he stood up, that's going to have some body in it. Look at the size of those cuffs. Extremely, and of course it's a watered silk, but this is I felt a good example of the very formal dress coat. Of course, this is more in the French style, but the English at this time, by mid-century, they still had an equivalent of this. But comparison of the two. But here's what the English began to do. Now the other painting, the Hogarth I was showing you was just a workman, a porter. But here we begin to see, this is by Gainsborough, and it is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, painted around 1750, so we're at mid-century. But you can see now how Mr. Andrews here has begun to adapt that workman's coat into a hunting jacket. And it does, what becomes significant are these turn-down collars. At one time had a very practical purpose, because if the weather was bad, it was cold, you could always button them up, you know, around your chin. And somehow that kind of stuck, you know, even if it wasn't going to be put into much of a practical function, it began to stay. It became a hallmark of the frock coat, that it would have this turn-down collar. And I didn't point that out on the Latour. It really didn't have much of a collar. But when the formal dress coats began to get a collar, they're just a very, and I'll show you one later, a high-standing collar. This one happens to be double-breasted, still has a bit of a cuff on it here. But you can see how very loose in the body. And this is another from, we're moving on down a little bit. This is a Joseph Wright of Mr. and Mrs. Coltman. And again, he's wearing a frock coat. Obviously, they're intending to go out riding. But think of that Latour of the very formally dressed Frenchman. And when I say that the coat was much softer in the body, it just didn't have the inner linings that those other coats did. The sleeve began to get very trim. If there was a cuff at all, it didn't extend out like that very formal dress coat, but it was very close to the arm. It didn't get in the way. It still has a bit of a collar, although now it's lying a little closer on the shoulder than perhaps the one we saw earlier. But this is then another development of the frock coat. So when it first begins to appear, it's in the English countryside, but the English gentlemen find them just a very handy garment. But they begin to work their way on into more sophisticated wear, lying in the woods, back to nature, and if you could see it better, he's even reading his Rousseau. So this is I put this one in to say, we now are seeing the frock coat in a very fashionably attired British gentleman, Sir Brooke Boothby. So when we get to Jefferson, he too is wearing the frock coat. It does appear, Mather Brown, I think he's trying to indicate that it is velvet. This is probably, of course, a silk satin, so very fine fabrics. The very elaborate jabot that he has attached to the shirt, and a nice ruffle here. But I put this in. This is another Mather Brown, and it was painted about the same time. Jefferson set for his portrait in 1786. Bulfinch was visiting in London. Of course, he's from Boston. He's a young architect. Was visiting there 1785 to 86 is when Mather Brown did this portrait. But their coats are similar. This one, though, with the large metal buttons, would indicate to me is probably made in England. But again, another stripe, nice striped waistcoat. He has not quite so elaborate as Jabot. His hair is also dressed and powdered, but not quite as formally dressed as Jefferson's, in that he has just kind of frizzed aside. He doesn't have the curls here. And I did bring out my paper that I think Jefferson preferred to have his hair dressed rather than wear wigs. You had that option. And from all indications, he did prefer just to have his hair dressed. But I put this one in to show that I think Jefferson looks very formal to us. But it's not unlike what another young American over there touring, you know, probably on his continental tour, does not look radically different from what we see in Jefferson. But one thing I think interesting in the Jefferson portrait, and again, this is going to be hard to see, but what props does he choose? Now, you always have the argument, did the artist put this in, but how much does the sitter himself have options on what he wants to be, how he wants to be depicted? I tend to think Jefferson probably had quite a bit of say in what he wanted. The artist might have suggested, well, let's give you some parchment and some papers. This had long-standing been a prop in painting to signify a statesman, a scholar. Oh, good, that helps a bit. So I think, you know, the artist might even have thought, well, sure, you know, with this diplomat here, we're going to put this in. This is the prop that I find far more interesting, and can't help but wonder if Jefferson didn't maybe request this goddess of liberty in the background, and here we see her a little better. This was a very well-known image, as I'm sure most of you are aware. This kind of a female figure in antique dress, and then, of course, the main point here is the staff with the liberty cap, which then tells us that it is representing liberty, and I went into that a little bit more in my paper. But I really would wonder if Jefferson didn't really want to have liberty standing there, because of course when anyone views this portrait, if it is indeed going to be with his worthies in his Paris residence, I mean, they're going to look at that and immediately equate him, of course, with republicanism, liberty, although the symbol for liberty, that had been used by many, and as I said, it was a very popular image. And the images are numerous, and I'm sure you can think of more than what I'm going to be showing you, and I know Marty's going to be showing you also one. I thought this one was kind of interesting. This is one by Charles Willson Peale. Early on in his career, he painted this, I think, 1767, yeah. And it had been commissioned. A group of men actually around the Chesapeake region had gone together and commissioned Peale, who was in London at the time, to do a portrait of William Pitt, who they felt was very supportive of of America and the colonies. But Pitt was very ill at the time, and so the best that Peale could do, but he didn't want to lose the commission, so the best he could do was to paint from a statue of Pitt, and he puts him in this kind of sculpture garden. But of course the piece that I'm interested in is he's beckoning back here to liberty, or the goddess of liberty, with the staff and the cap in the back. Then the other that I put here with it, this was done in 1778, and it's another of those innumerable Franklin images that came out in 78, 79, around in that period on his return, when he goes to, returns to Europe, but goes to France. He actually posed for this. I don't know if he was going to be he knew he was going to be in a toga and sandals, but he did actually pose for this artist. But then when the artist wanted to put the dedication, down below to Franklin, Franklin went, how about we don't do that? So it did not have his name on it, but everyone knows, of course, this is Benjamin Franklin. This, America was often represented as an Indian maid, and she's here with embracing this column, again, with liberty standing here, with the staff, the liberty cap, other figures. I think this is Neptune and Britannia that are being dashed into the water here. So a lot of symbolism in this particular print, but again, we have liberty. And this is one place I think I mentioned in my paper that Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, remember they were immediately put on the committee to design a seal for the United States in July 1776. None of their designs were accepted. It got tabled. It went on through quite a while before they came up with what they thought was an appropriate seal. This is the reverse of the Great Seal of Virginia, and there in the center is, again, that figure of liberty, the staff, the liberty cap. So I only put these in, and this was also designed in 1776. There was some modification made in 1779. But again, Jefferson, the world, I guess I could say, would have been very familiar with this image, but it was very important in the United States at this particular time. And this one was much later. This wasn't done by an American artist, Edward Savage, until 1796. But this one, actually, there's a print of it today that still hangs in Monticello. Jefferson owned a copy of this print, and we know it did hang at Monticello. And then, but now she doesn't have the staff in hand, but it kind of is floating back here with the cap, and now we have the American flag attached. So I think I've driven that point home, that it was a very important image. I didn't realize I'd put in quite so many. But this is the companion portrait that was done by Mather Brown, and this is then, of course, John Adams. He looks a lot more a little more conservative, probably a little more American to us, or as we might envision that American at this time should look, a good Republican. But I want you to remember, this was very, very fashionable. And so even though he's in kind of I would guess probably a three-piece suit, it's in a very kind of neutral color, no trim, but if you look closely, it has a very nice, high-standing, crisp collar, lots of metal buttons, which were very popular in London at the time. This very slim sleeve with the ventricle, the vent here, which is cut in that vertical line. So even though it does not look quite as flashy as Jefferson's, it is nevertheless a very, very fine suit. And it is very much fashionable, but I must say it's very conservative. And I'm beginning to see that somewhat in Adams. And I'm not as much up on Adams' portraiture as Jefferson, but I began to watch it. And I think I would venture to say that he's always very nicely dressed, very stylish, but it is always a little bit conservative, would kind of be my estimate of it. I think the main thing, you're not seeing quite the elaborate jabot, but again, he's got on a very finely dressed wig. Again, this wig being very low is very conservative, a little bit out of date. Now, I did mention there are some miniatures that again we see Jefferson in a very European look. These are the two miniatures that I mentioned in my paper that John Trumbull did for this one was done for Angelica Church, and this was done for Maria Causeway. And very similar in the look, but again, and it's mainly really, if you look at it, it's the dress of the hair and that heavy powder, very formally dressed. He probably has what was called a bag, those black silk bags that would cover the queue. That was very European and very, very, a little bit more of the fashion, I guess we could say. What I found interesting in these portraits is that the one that he did for the daughter Martha, we have a different look to it. Now, actually, the coat, he's still in a dark frock coat. He still has on a buff-colored waistcoat, which was not that different. Let me slip back. Well, no, I think actually I have them all together. Let's just go into the all together so we can get on through these. But see, the coloration, now this is double-breasted, but it's still, these are just the frock coat that you're seeing. You're seeing a buff-colored waistcoat, which was very popular. He's got a high wrapped cravat or stock and the jabot. But again, what I think makes it different is the more casual dress of the hair. It's not powdered. It's just not as formally dressed, and that's the main difference. But I have found it very interesting, and I'd like to explore it a little bit more, the differences in these three portraits and for these three different women. And of course, I'll just put this one in because Trumbull, this is when he was beginning that big history painting that's now up in Washington in the Rotunda of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, July 4, 1776, very long title. But this is where he took then that image that we see, I think, especially in the Martha portrait. So even Trumbull here, I feel, is making a distinction in a look that's appropriate and more common for Europe, and making a little distinction in the look we see for what is definitely going to be for either an American, being Jefferson's young daughter Martha, or for an American audience. Because always in these things you want, I think the artist did consider, who's going to be viewing this portrait, what's the purpose of it? And so I do think it is interesting that he changes Jefferson's, the look of formality. The clothing items are really still very much the same, but he does change the look, mainly the dress of the hair. This is an example of, this is by Vigée Lebrun, and it's the Comte de Vaudreuil, and I found a very good example of what formal court wear how it would look, because I think to our eye, Jefferson looked very formally dressed, but this would be more of the style that would have been at the court of Versailles. That formal dress coat had a very high standing collar. You see all the braid, the trim. And in my paper, I gave that well-known quote from Shippen about when he was presented at Versailles, Jefferson presented him there. Then he noted all the ribbons and the medals and how Jefferson didn't have all of this. Well, here, of course, we have the cordon bleu and the matching medallion there, and this is the Medal of St. Louis. So this is more what Shippen might have been seeing at Versailles. And I mentioned in the beginning of my paper, the first things that Jefferson dashes out to purchase is the lace and a chapeau bras and a dress sword, because those were still considered very much the marks of a gentleman. what a gentleman, you know, must have. So Vidruya is a very good example. But what did Jefferson wear to court? And because I don't think he wore what we saw in the Mather Brown portrait, I think he would have worn a more formal coat. But this is that one by Copley, which I'm sure you've seen, of John Adams, painted in 1783. So it would have been shortly after he just arrived in London from, and after, of course, the treaty at Versailles. But he is very definitely more in court dress. But it is a brown velvet. It's just a matching suit. It does not have the braid that we saw on Vidruya's. Oh, and these were painted just a year apart. Adams set in 1783 for Copley, and then Vidruya in 1784. So they're comparable in time period. Adams, a little old-fashioned here in that it's just a little bit of a collar. He's not going quite as far. The thing that is interesting, though, in the Copley, and how much did Adams suggest this, but the thing that is very formal about this is mainly this pose, this gesture, the stance, is something that you see in what are sometimes called the swagger portraits, the grand manner portraits. But this is something that you would very much see an aristocratic European portraiture. And maybe that's why later Adams seemed a little embarrassed by this portrait. He called it a bijou, a piece of vanity, and I believe I put that in my paper. But this is showing him then in how I think both he and Jefferson, more how they would have appeared at Versailles rather than in that frock coat. And I think we're about through these. Yeah, this is it. I just put the three men back in here because I guess then my main point from this is even though especially Jefferson looks very formal to us here, I do think he's kind of straddling the line between what would not be unacceptable to an American viewing this, but yet it's very appropriate for how he would have to appear at court. And how much was he willing to push the boundaries? Even Adams, a little more sedate perhaps, but how much would he push the boundaries here on appearance? I think it's only Ben Franklin that was able to get away with it, for sure. So that, I think, is kind of the end of it here.